Hi, this is Russ Walden with Father's Heart Ministry. On December 21st of this month, the Mayan calendar grinds to a halt and starts a new long count. There's been much speculation as to cataclysmic possibilities regarding this event, and even some have suggested that the I Ching, which is a Chinese method of prognostication that's quite ancient, runs out of numerical values or combinations and restarts as well on this exact time. And because of that, much attention again is being focused upon the end of days, upon social, economic, natural disasters, that kind of thing. And eventually we get around to looking again at the book of Revelation. The thing to remember about the book of Revelation, the Apokalypsus, is that it's primarily a revealing of Jesus Christ. And it was born not out of a theological treatise by a committee of seminarians, but it was produced by a man who'd been exiled to a very foreboding location, isolated, and out of his own intimacy and his personal relationship with Jesus, these realities and these revelations came to him. And I'm going to read you from a book that I've written called Face to Face with the Father, a chronicle of the men and women who saw the face of God and lived. The chapter I'm going to read you is chapter number 20, which is the last chapter of the book, that tells the story of a fictional account of an actual event when John received the Apokalypsus, when he received the revelation. And I want you to see it not only as a record of one of the most influential harbingers of the end times in this document, but also a record of a man's intimate experience with God that was almost unparalleled outside the experience of Paul on the road to Damascus or Ezekiel on the plain, which is also spoken of in the book. And the book, by the way, can be attained from Father's Heart Ministry. If you go to our online store at fathersheartmedia.com, you could order the book. And each chapter is a burning bush experience of those who saw God's face and lived and were forever changed and went out to be life changers and world changers themselves. So chapter 20, Face to Face with the Father by Russell Walden. John on Patmos. Revelation 1:10. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and heard behind me a great voice as of a trumpet, saying, I am Alpha and Omega, the first and the last. What you see, write in a book. And when I saw him, I fell at his feet as dead. And he laid his right hand upon me, saying to me, Fear not, I am the first and the last. In the flickering tallow light of the terracotta lamp beside him, John looked down at the blank scroll spread on the table. The left end of the scroll he had weighted with a stone, about the size of his palm. The other end he allowed to unroll, dropping off the right side of the table where the lamp flickered, casting undulating shadows on the cave walls round about him. Not wanting the bulk of the scroll to be soiled on the damp cave floor, he had placed beneath it the only other piece of furniture afforded him, a stool similar to his own, reserved for his infrequent visitors. Not what I asked for, he grumbled to himself, smoothing the papyrus with his palms. His table was quite rough, and the papyrus itself was of a low quality, grainy, and coarse. He had asked his friend Prophorus for parchment, which was available enough in Ephesus, where Porphyrius acquired the provisions necessary for John's survival on Patmos. "I am watched, John," Porphyrius had explained. This exchange took place when he had brought the non-preferred papyrus and the few meager provisions needed to sustain his exiled leader in this remote place the Romans had exiled him to. If he had taken the time to find something other than this crude writing material, the Romans would have known John was making an effort to communicate with his followers from whom he was now banished. They would have refused Porphyrius permission to visit John, which would have meant slow starvation and death for the older man. No one on Patmos survived long without support from the outside, especially the elder John. John hesitated, rubbing his tired eyes. How long had he sat here staring? The blank scroll mocked him, daring him to put to writing the experiences of the previous weeks. Even now, the recollection made his hands shake and his belly quaver. He barely believed it himself, and he had been the singular witness. Even his closest friends might only conclude that John the Aged had finally succumbed to the rigors of isolation, torture, and stress that so marked his life for these many decades. Why, John mused, had he been chosen to bear this burden? John dipped his quill and held it to the scroll, doing so with both hands to still the trembling. Behind him, the makeshift door rattled in the rock face of the cave entrance. The cave had been his shelter since his banishment to Patmos. The gathering storm was burying the island in full force now. The pelting rain sliced through the rough-hewn planks he himself had erected across the entrance to the cave on the south side of the isle. John retrieved his one sole blanket from the driest recesses of the cave where he had stored it. Seating himself again, he wrapped himself tightly in the vain attempt to escape the cold, doing his best to draw his sandaled feet within the meager warmth his blanket afforded. The cave was not suited for the purpose to which he had put it. It was shelter only because he had no other choice of dwelling on this isolated island. The few hapless residents of the isle were loath to share their accommodations with him at any price, given his status of disfavor with the Romans. So here, in this remote part of the island, in this drafty, wet shelter, he had done the best he could to protect himself from wind, predators, and the occasional marauders that plundered the homes of the luckless inhabitants of Patmos. Steeling himself, he scrawled one word across the writing surface in script that he would later realize was larger than necessary. Apokalypsus. The revealing. How could he even put to words the full measure of what he had seen and heard? John questioned. The wind outside picked up and then blasted suddenly against his flimsy door. It sprang open, partially off one hinge, blowing his parchment off the table, dousing his lamp, and leaving his hovel in complete disarray and darkness. John leapt up in alarm, anger rising in his frame. He was too old for this, he thought, shoving the door shut again and blocking it, as best he could, with a stone kept near the entrance for that purpose. His mind wandered lingeringly to his comfortable quarters in Ephesus, across the stormy Aegean this night. It was warm and well lit, attended to by faithful friends and followers. Why did this most important of all assignments come to him in this place, most inopportune to accomplishing it? Banishment, he growled out loud to himself. He could hardly hear his own voice above the howling wind outside. What else could the pagans resort to, he thought, after the apparent debacle at Domitian's court? There were wild rumors about what had happened after he had been taken in chains to Rome, to stand before the emperor. Some claimed he had been cast into a vat of boiling oil and was miraculously unharmed. Such wild stories had followed him like a plague ever since his days with the master. Young Porphyrius had followed the company of legionnaires when they took John in chains to Rome. He was in the Colosseum for John's trial. He had hoped to bring news back to the disciples at Ephesus regarding John's fate, so the elders there would not be left to believe the mere official report from Rome. The Romans would doubtless claim John had died squealing for mercy. This had been the common practice of the authorities when a Christian was executed. It would never do, in their eyes, to have a follower of the way to die bravely. Porphyrius, a young deacon in the Ephesus community, was of Roman citizenship. He could hopefully pass unmolested into the arena where John was to be tried. He had bravely risked his life to bear witness to the true character of what they were sure would be John's martyrdom. Later, when John would ask of his friend about that day, Porphyrius' reply was a terse one. "I have nothing to say, John." John had asked the young deacon more than once because for some reason John couldn't fathom the entire event was a blur of memory. He could only vaguely remember the blows and abuse of the soldiers as they tormented him before Domitian's dais at the Colosseum. He could recall the roar of laughter as they made sport of his old age and infirmity. Then, nothing. The next thing John remembered was coming to himself in the back of an ox cart outside of Rome. He was sore and exhausted, but surprisingly intact. Porphyrius was driving the oxen at as gentle a pace as he could, all the while stealing disbelieving looks at his mentor and elder. "They've given you 30 days to report to Patmos," Porphyrius had informed him over the clatter of oxen on the Roman cobblestones. "After that, if you are found off the island, you'll be executed on the spot." John had wondered aloud why they didn't execute him the day before. Porphyrius simply looked at him blankly. That was 6 months ago. John puzzled over why the Romans themselves hadn't taken charge to deposit him at that remote location. And why, he had wondered at the time, did they banish him so close to his home in Ephesus, where they had to know he would be provisioned and in communication with his supporters? "Romans are superstitious, John. You know that as well as I," Porphyrius had observed. After what had happened at the Colosseum, he broke off. John only looked at his young friend. With a questioning expression, Porphyrius looked away. He had queried him many times as they crossed the Aegean to Patmos. He could never get any more out of him, although he was sure at Ephesus Porphyrius had been more forthcoming with the elders there, judging by their incredulous stares. And now here he was under Roman edict, reporting on his own recognizance to this harsh place, with a new, all-important message to deliver to his disciples from his master. "Apokalypsus," he read out loud. Then repeating, he added the words, "Apokalypsus of the Christos." He would not allow this to be purely about the experience, the visions he had seen. This would not be a document of mere fantasy. In his writing, he knew the focus had to be upon the Christ, or the message was lost. Sitting back momentarily, he thought back to the gray morning a few weeks before. He was in prayer, walking a path he had made familiar to himself a short distance from his shelter. Pacing helped him compose himself when he prayed. He was gazing across the Aegean from a barren rocky hilltop when he heard a soft footfall behind him. Before he could turn, there came the peal of a blasting trumpet like those used in war. It seemed as though it came just inches from his ear. He winced at the pain and dropped on one knee, bowing his head to escape the ringing in his ears. His eyes were tightly shut, and he assumed that the Romans had sent soldiers for him. They had often tormented him when he was in their custody, with abuse and loud clangs and trumpets to deprive him of sleep. He waited for the blows that he expected to rain down upon him at any moment. He rolled protectively on his side, eyes still closed, flinching but not feeling the expected blow. The sound was deafening. It vibrated through his bones, bereaving him of all thought. His teeth ached from the pitch. He pressed his hands against his ears to no avail. It was as though the blast was impervious to any attempt to suppress it or shield himself from it. On the fringes of his own rationale, his mind assaulted under this rigor, came the residue of a question. Where were the expected Romans? This wasn't. What was this? I am the Alpha and the Omega, came the reply to his unvoiced question. The voice thundered through John's body so heavily he thought his bowels would loose. He cowered on the ground, his back to the voice, which continued. I am the first and the last. What you are about to see, write in a book. As the voice spoke, John sensed its source coming closer. He turned and opened his eyes to look between his palms. To his shock, he didn't see the barren landscape of Patmos that he knew should be right before him. In amazement, he saw instead, on a plain field of vision, a line of 7 lamps. Not just ordinary lamps, these were quite large, each perched upon a column of stone. The voice thundered on, and he heard the words Ephesus, Thyatira, Pergamos. These were all cities he knew. These communities each held families of disciples he knew and loved. He had traveled to their towns, slept in their homes, and ate at their tables. As each name came to him from the yet faceless voice, one of the lamps would blaze a light so bright its flame would obscure the lamp and even the pillar holding the lamp. Even as he questioned, he somehow knew that these lamps spoke to him of those that the Master said cannot be hid. These were the 7 churches, each that he knew well, that were being revealed to him in this way. John's body trembled, and his mind faltered as he tried to put sensibility to the irrational scene before him. As he gazed wordlessly on this scene before him, he watched as a figure stepped out from behind the lamps. It was a man wearing a linen garment, with a wide golden belt across his middle. As he walked past each candlestick, its flame burst into brightness tenfold, and John's entire field of vision was filled with light and flame, and this figure walking, in fact, to his alarm, advancing to where he cowered on the ground. As the figure came forward, the sound of the Aegean reached his ears. It was louder than he had heard it from this distance before. In fact, it was somewhat different than the familiar crashing of waves he was accustomed to. There was a cacophony to the sound, and it was getting closer. And the sounds began to form words. Surprised, he found the man now stood directly over him, and the sound of waves crashing was not coming from behind him. Rather, it was falling upon his ears from directly above where he lay, from the man's very mouth. John started to voice a cry of alarm, but now, in place of a mouth, he saw a sword dropping from the man's face directly toward John's heart. He gasped. He groped. He couldn't move, expecting at any moment to be impaled. Having lost all context of reality, this scene before him encompassed his whole being, his whole existence. He could attach no meaning, no import other than the awareness that all he was, all he had ever been, was focused with terrifying clarity on this one moment, upon this one man, who looked, for all his spectacular appearance, vaguely familiar. Before he could ponder that, the figure waved his hand across John's own face, now perspiring with fear. As he did this, a brilliant light, no, 7 lights burst from his opened fingers, blinding John. Terrified, he realized he could not see. Expecting impending death, he only knew to somehow attempt to appease this figure before him. He rolled on his belly, prostrate, reaching for the man's ankles in a classic universal plea for mercy from this vision of potency and power before him. To his shock, he realized he had never seen feet appear as this man's feet appeared. They were molten with light, and he felt as if he touched them, he would be instantly burned. He recoiled, raising himself on all fours. Suddenly, the strain was too great upon his tired, exhausted body. Heaving for breath, he felt his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't draw air, as though a great weight was on his heart. His right arm throbbed and went numb. In a paroxysm of shock, his whole body spasmodically heaved, and he lay still, looking sightlessly, helplessly up at the form of this otherworldly figure towering over him, with lights and fire blazing around him in a chorus and meaning to which that he was oblivious to now know in his state of insensibility. Then all was black and silence. He came to himself, casting about in his mind. Where was he? Who was he? He wondered, but then did not feel the bed under him that was so familiar to his comfort in Ephesus. Neither did he feel the slimy dankness of his cave in the cell. Where was he? Now he remembered himself. He was John, the brother of James, follower of the Master. He still could not open his eyes. With great longing, he realized that his head didn't rest on any pallet or pillow. His face was resting on something warm, and it was rising and falling rhythmically. Suddenly he gasped a deep gulp of air as the familiarity of that warmth came rushing back to him. An experience he had put away in a deep place in his mind for decades. He hadn't wanted to think of it. He missed the Master so. All those days walking from Galilee to Jerusalem. Nights around the cook fires, listening to that timeless voice echoing in that breast as he lay his head like a child on the heart of the Master. He opened his eyes and he found his voice, Jesus. Soft brown eyes looked down upon him, cradling his head in arms that John had for so long ached to know the touch of again. John. The old man forgot himself momentarily. Suddenly he was almost a boy again in company with the teacher. The love that passed between them was carried afresh and anew via the wonderful memories that came rushing back with every breath as those eyes probed his, reaching into the depth of John's heart, touching every wound, every pain, every deprivation and suffering. Fear not, John. It is I. I am the first and the last, the beginning and the end. And I am the one that loved you then and loves you now. And I am commissioning you to speak my love that I reveal to you now in this vision. And with that, the figure, which he now identified unmistakably, took John's shoulders and turned him about, resting his head under Jesus' chin, looking outward at the panoramic scene before them both. Looking up to a beautiful cloud formation, he saw a door form in the midst of the cloud, and it opened to his view. And out from the opened door came a panorama of sight and sound that defied his ability to articulate later. But somehow each detail, each vision registered on his memory with crystal clarity. He knew this to be the revelation of what lay within the heart of his Master, and he reveled with each unveiling. As his Master, Jesus, the resurrected Christ, equally reveled in the intimate unveiling of his handiwork, past, present, and future. John moaned sharply and opened his eyes at his desk. He felt the memories of that experience as fresh as though they still echoed off the walls around him. The command came back to him afresh and anew. What you see, write in a book. He took up his quill again, oblivious to the storm, the cold, the hunger, and began to write furiously on the papyri before him. The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave unto him, to show unto his servants things which must shortly come to pass, and he sent and signify it by his angel unto his servant John.